So I should start by introducing myself, and I'm hoping the people online can both hear me and perhaps even can see me. Oh, there's the camera up there. So if people could keep the camera in mind and remember there are people online, use the microphone, that would be most helpful. And Dan, I presume if there are questions from our online audience, I presume we're going to try and capture them. Okay, all right, but we'll pick that up. Anyhow, I should start by introducing myself. I'm Mike Shipman. I'm Pro Vice Chancellor International, and I have overall responsibility for Warwick's international strategy. So it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, both for our distinguished African lecture later this afternoon and for this launch event that we have here preceding that. So I'm not going to take up much of your time other than really just to thank you for coming. I think this will be a very interesting session, particularly grateful to our speakers and panelist participants for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us here today. And this session is actually about the launch of the UNCTAD Warwick RIPOA, this is a catchy title, isn't it? Initiative for the establishment of an Africa Inequality Learning Group. And this is a really important topic. It's aligned with one of the SDGs, as we'll no doubt hear lots more about later. I think it will be really interesting. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some brief opening statements from three key components and three key advocates for this learning group. And then we're going to have a panel discussion that is going to be chaired by Caroline. And there'll be opportunity to ask questions and to quiz the panel and explore these things in a bit more detail. But first off, we're going to invite each of the key participating organisations, if you like, to say a few words from their perspective about the objectives and scope of the initiative. So first off, from the United Nations, we have Patrick Asakwi, who is going to, if he can get out, is going to say a few opening remarks about why his organisation is very keen to participate in this learning group. So over to you, Patrick.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Professor Mike Shipman, Pro Vice Chancellor, University of Warwick, distinguished participants. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the launch of the Africa Inequality Learning Group. May I also seize this opportunity to thank the management and staff of the University of Warwick for hosting this event and for the support they have provided to get this initiative off the ground. There are just 3 points that I would like to make in my opening remarks. The first is that if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal of ending poverty, there must be an increased focus on what is happening in Africa, because that is where the challenge of poverty eradication is immense. Sub-Saharan Africa's share of global poverty in 1990 was 14%. Now it's about 60%. And the number of poor people in the region continues to increase. One of the reasons why global poverty is increasingly concentrated in Africa is the high level of income inequality, which has reduced the growth elasticity of poverty in the continent. My second point is on the need for African countries to mainstream inequality into national development strategies, both at the policy design and at the policy implementation phases. Too often, distribution issues are either not addressed in policy formulation or are treated in an ad hoc manner. For example, it is well known that trade reforms create winners and losers in the short and medium terms, and so have consequences for income distribution. Yet, in most African countries, policymakers rarely address how to compensate the losers during the policy design phase of reforms. Inequality becomes an issue, mostly when things go wrong during policy implementation. In this context, there is a need for an inclusive and coherent approach to policy design and implementation to ensure that no one is left behind in the development process. And this is where the Inequality Learning Group initiative comes in. It will raise awareness as well as sensitize policymakers on the importance of integrating distribution issues into both the policy design and implementation phases of planning. In addition, it will provide a good platform for policymakers to interact with academics conducting research on inequality, thereby ensuring that policymakers have easy access to new information and research findings on distribution issues. It will also permit policymakers to share experiences and identify best practices in combating inequality at the national level. My third and final point is on the expected outcome of this initiative, which is enhanced understanding by policymakers of the challenges of inequality and how to develop effective policies to address them. Through the initiative, we are also hoping to increase visibility and awareness on the Sustainable Development Goal 10, which focuses on reducing inequalities within and among countries. Distinguished participants, with these remarks, I thank you for your attention and look forward to your contributions to this important dialogue.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And now I'd like to invite our colleague from RIPOA. And for those of you that don't know, RIPOA is a Tanzanian think tank on research and policy areas. And we are very grateful and delighted to have Dr. Donald Mari here to say a few words about his perspective on this new learning group.
Thank you very much, Professor Shipman. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking also Professor Lisk and Dr. Osakwe for the good collaboration in getting this process starting. And of course, I'd like to thank the University of Warwick and all of you distinguished guests for being here this afternoon. Let me begin by quoting the Secretary General of the United Nations in his report to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations regarding the SDGs, halfway to 2030. I quote, "The Sustainable Development Goals are disappearing in the rear view mirror, and with them, the hope and rights of current and future generations. A fundamental shift is needed in commitment, solidarity, financing, and action to put the world on a better path, and it is needed now," end of quote. While there has been some progress towards SDGs, for many of them, progress has been slow and small. Out of 140 targets, only 12% are on track. While the report projects that 575 million people will still be living in poverty by 2030, and only 1/3 of countries will be able to have poverty. Half of the global poor lives in Africa, and the first sign of significant inequality between the world regions. Progress towards achieving SDGs, SDG number 10 on reducing inequality between and within countries is very slow, with only about 10% of countries on track to meet the target. We all know that COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing Ukraine crisis has slowed the progress even further. The world's population has now reached 8 billion and is projected to grow to 9.8 billion in 2050. 8 countries are projected to account for half of the projected global population growth, of which 5 are in Africa. And to mention them, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. If half of the poor people lives in Africa, given the slow rates of reduction of poverty and inequality, many questions arise. What will this population distribution mean for the world? What are the potential implications on food security, conflict, and migration? What are the drivers of increasing inequality between countries and within countries, particularly in Africa? We already know that Africa is disproportionately bearing the impact and the effect of climate change and unbalanced trade and economic injustices. But is it all? These are just few questions we can raise with respect to inequality, in addition to the traditional inequality subjects, which are the differences in the relative shares of income among quintiles, access to various social services by different segments of the population, and gender differences in access to economic and livelihood opportunities. In recent years, the platform enterprises that have grown out of the digital revolution provide an example of how positive technological development can also create inequalities, because economic power is shifted from producers and labor to distributors and venture capital. Can these diverse outcomes be maintained without harming economic growth and prosperity? So in an attempt to find answers to these questions and to identify common pathways out and lasting solutions are very compelling reasons to establish African Inequality Learning Group. Please join us and support this initiative for the common good of the world we cherish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And for our last speaker in this sort of introductory session, to sort of set a bit of the context for this Inequality Learning Group, have the great pleasure inviting our very own Professor Franklin Lisk to come up and say a few words. Over to you, Franklin.
Sorry, Mike, I may have to sit down. My leg is not too good.
So you can either flip it on or just hold it.
Where? Oh, just where do we click it in? Just put it here. Okay, good. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Mike. I would first of all like to thank my 2 collaborators in this partnership. Patrick from UNCTAD in Geneva and Donald from REPOA in Tanzania, a think tank. I think it's significant because we are an academic institution and we are now collaborating with a UN policy institution and with an independent think tank from a developing country. So I think that's the value of this partnership. Second, I would like to thank my colleagues across the Warwick community, because the subject of inequality is of interest to virtually every corner of the Warwick community. I can think of this initiative was developed largely on behalf of the Africa Hub by Economics and PACE, but others are involved and will be involved, and this includes colleagues from law, from health and life sciences, from philosophy, and even from arts. The issue of inequality is one which is very important, particularly in the context of Africa, where it's associated with poverty and economic insecurity. So even though you have inequality globally, the situation in Africa is particularly serious because the effects of inequality impact on the everyday life and living standard of societies, and this is now increasingly understood. But what is more challenging and difficult to understand from a policy perspective is to understand what are the causes of inequality. Why is it growing so rapidly? And why is it difficult to reduce inequality significantly? The answer to these questions, which go beyond the social impact of the phenomenon, call for an understanding of the importance of economic and political governance concerns and the need for an injection of morality in public policy. The establishment today of an African inequality learning group seeks to deliberately provide a platform for policymakers and academics to discuss inequality, its causes and consequences, and what can be done about it. The platform will be a forum for exchange of experiences and sharing of knowledge about the nature and impact of inequality, with a view to drawing lessons for development policies and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. The initiative that we are launching today will make use of data on access to basic needs and essential services, and also of evidence about changes in the political and economic landscape, such as those relating to the lack of opportunity in terms of the profound effects on inequality. In terms of a broad policy prescription, if we want to consider action to reduce and eliminate inequality, if ever this can be achieved, this can be summed up as the need for society to do what it is necessary to make sure that everyone has access to basic needs, the basic needs of food, shelter, clean water, health, education, and perhaps more importantly, an equal opportunity for everyone to succeed. These general comments preface my specific remarks about the situation in Africa. The magnitude of inequality and the lack of opportunity across Africa cannot be denied. The evidence is there for all to see, and we find statistics at global, regional, and national level that supports this view that inequality is increasing and it's a serious problem in Africa. While income and wealth inequality has risen in many countries globally in recent decades, the problem is more serious in Africa because, as the two previous speakers said, poverty is widespread, and there is the related concern of economic insecurity. What we have in Africa, unfortunately, is increasingly unequal societies, and these tend to weaken trust in public institutions and undermine democratic governance. And in some cases, they have led to social tensions and political polarization. Inequality levels in sub-Saharan Africa is believed to be the highest in the world. When this information was passed on to me by Patrick, I thought probably it's an exaggeration, but I did find time to check the statistics. And Africa is one of the most unequal societies globally. This situation itself calls for reflection. The fact that inequality in sub-Saharan Africa is believed to be the highest means that we have to look at these causes or the sources of inequality, and I'll briefly, without going into much explanation, distinguish wealth inequality from income inequality. And what we tend to have in Africa is a situation where wealth inequality between countries are typically higher than income inequality. And because of the higher wealth inequality, this contributes to future income inequality through capital accumulation by a very small privileged elite and through inheritance. We can see this in the case of some of the small, very rich, oil-rich economies in Africa, where probably a fraction of 1% of the population have access to and enjoy well over 80% of the nation's wealth. So you have to use Paul Collier's phrase, the bottom billion is there without any support, particularly in instances where we do not have social security systems. The purpose of this learning group is not what we academics tend to do, that is to argue or quibble about quantifying the incidence and level of inequality, or on how to assess and value spending on and benefits supplied by different remedial actions. Nor do we wish to spend much time talking about how we measure the gap between the concentration of wealth at the top of the very rich, often less than 1% of the population, and the deprivation of basic needs of the billions at the bottom of the pyramid. I believe that the initiative we are launching today is not going to spend, or I would even say waste time with issues of definitions, concepts and methods or tools of measurement of inequality as it affects African countries and peoples. Nor will it dwell on the mundane issues such as eroding the role of the market system or failure of the political system. It will, however, in its own line of action, focus on lessons from experience that underline the debilitating role of large-scale and endemic corruption, which tends to fuel inequality in African societies. That has to be understood if we want to come up with proposals and policies to address inequality. I know that those of you who are economists amongst us would say that there has been a case for supporting inequality in the initial stage of development, the Kuznets curve, which says that at the initial stage of development, you need to have some inequality to enable the economy to take off. And after it has reached the crucial stage where things are moving in the right direction, inequality will decline. But this has not been the experience of Africa, unfortunately. And therefore, I would not lend any credence to this this issue of applying the Kuznets curve to the African situation. Nor might I even support the issue of the trickle-down effect, that if you allow some inequality and if some people make a lot of money in a typical extended family system, some of this money, whether legally or corruptly acquired, will trickle down. I don't think it is having any significant impact on reducing inequality, so I will not support this sort of options. I believe that if we focus, as we intend to do in the learning group, on sharing actual experiences and the effects of these experiences on human and physical development, and we identify best practices in addressing inequality under different circumstances, and we understand our public policy response to the dynamics of measures to reduce inequality, and then, and perhaps more critically, we strengthen advocacy on why inequality cannot and should not be tolerated under any circumstances. And we highlight the social, political, and economic consequences of increasing inequality. I like to end by saying that the initiative that we are launching is based on hope that the establishment of an African learning group on inequality would provide a platform for understanding why inequality is bad for development and for grasping every chance and means through key deliverables. For example, I have talked to Patrick about the possibility of making use of conferences, ministerial conferences organized by the Economic Commission for Africa or the African Union or the African Development Bank, so that we can have side events and hopefully sensitize or develop an interest in the subject among key policymakers. And we're also looking at the possibility for, at the individual country level, to create some sort of a dialogue between major stakeholders. And if we do this, I believe that in the wider context, reference has been made to the fact that the Sustainable Development Goal number 10 is focused on reducing inequalities within and between countries. We believe that if the initiative as we envisage it works out and attracts the type of interest that we wish it would, then we would be working towards more equitable societies in Africa, a more equitable power balance in all spheres of decision making and policy influence, including the gender balance. And this would constitute, in my view, a recipe for Africa's rapid and just socioeconomic transformation. And therefore, I believe that tackling inequality, which we aim to do through this initiative, must be at the top of the development agenda of academic institutions like ours, of United Nations institutions, of African countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Franklin. I think after all of those opening speeches, we've got a little bit of a flavour of what the learning group is all about, some of the challenges that Africa and other parts of the world face in terms of inequality. And now I'm going to hand over to Caroline Elliott, who's Deputy Head of the Economics Department, and I'm going to let her introduce her panel, who are going to further develop and explore these ideas further. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, Franklin, as well. So just while our panelists come to the front, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for coming to this opening session and this discussion. It's a panel session on the case for equality, different perspectives, and we have some fantastic different perspectives this afternoon. Our panelists either are at Warwick or have previously been at Warwick, and they have different but complementary areas of expertise which encompass ethics, finance, political economy, health and global politics. So it's going to be an interesting session. They will each give their opening remarks and then we will turn to all of you to ask them questions. We don't have any pre-planned questions, so it's your chance to put them all on the spot. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and give their opening remarks in the order that they appear in the programme, if you have a programme. So that will be Sophie, then Samuel, then Joy, then Ben. So let's see if that microphone works, and it will be over to you, Sophie. Hang on.
Can you hear me first?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, well. Okay, how's that?
Perfect, thank
It's
you.
always the gender politics of not wearing a tie. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. My name's Sophie Harman. I'm a professor of international politics at Queen Mary, University of London, and I'm an ex-Warwick employee. So Warwick was the home of my first ever job. Frank was my first boss, which I always like to start these conversations with. So it's a real pleasure to be back here today. At a special side event of the UN General Assembly in September last year, African heads of states and heads of delegations launched their call for a new public health order. This new public health order had been percolating since 2021 at the International Conference of Public Health in Africa, but of course was a kind of reaction to what had happened between 2020 and 2021 with the COVID-19 pandemic and its real gross inequalities that were experienced across the African continent. Most notably, African countries struggling to secure basic medical countermeasures such as testing kits, PPE, and of course, as we know, access to vaccines, with many African countries being at the back of the queue when it came to getting the vaccine. But more than that, it wasn't that just these countries were at the back of the queue. This queue was really problematic. It was based on outdated charity models, most notably through the COVAX funding facility, other richer countries giving African countries leftovers, which soon expired, which created problems of trust within the community, delays and supply gaps when India stopped exporting vaccines in 2021. And at the height of the kind of crisis in 2021, 80% of vaccines were going to high-income countries. At the time, 0.3% coverage was happening in low-income countries. So huge, stark inequalities there. Also, then when African states responded to this and said this is grossly unfair and unequal, you saw a kind of drawn out process within the World Trade Organization trying to use the TRIPS flexibilities that have been deliberately set up after HIV and AIDS to give some flexibility of access to medicine and patents. But again, this was drawn out and bogged down, and again, the back of the queue incidents happened again. And then there was a pandemic fund launched by the World Bank that said countries, low-income countries, middle-income countries can borrow from the pandemic fund to strengthen their resilience to global health security, so particularly targeting African countries. But African countries weren't actually allowed to apply for the money directly. They had to go through a third-party intermediary, be it the Global Fund, the World Health Organization, or I think the African Development Bank, even though the preferred partner was Africa's Centre for Disease Control, Africa's CDC. So if you think about this, we've got back of the queue, delayed in the trade policy, even with funds told that you had to go through a third party. And to top it off, so my expertise is on global health politics, hence I'm just going on this global health tip, is everything I've learned about global health politics is from the continent of Africa. It's from learning about countries' responses to HIV and AIDS. It's about learning what happened in the 2 Ebola crises and from experts on the continent. When you came to see the experts that were involved in the COVID-19 response, all those lessons learned were completely ignored. Okay, this was particularly in North America and Europe. All that expertise you could take from Africa was completely sidelined. So this is a maddening situation, and it's an infantilizing situation. And therefore, you can see why you have this new call for action of a new public health order. But it's more than that. It's not just COVID-19. These issues have been percolating for decades. The African continent has the highest incidence of public health emergencies annually. It's still the center of the other major pandemic in the world, the HIV and AIDS pandemic. It has to respond to the new threats that all countries in the world do, such as antimicrobial resistance and the growth of non-communicable diseases. And underpinning all of this is consistent problems with the global health system. The idea that institutions in global health don't necessarily respond to or listen to the needs of African people and African states. Compounding that, the brain drain of African health workers. So if you're in the UK, I'm sure you saw in the news last week that there are more Ghanaian nurses working in the British NHS than there is in Ghana. These have been problems that have been around for a very long time, and COVID-19 really brought this to the world's attention. Well, not the world's attention, because lots of the world already knew it, but basically saying you can't ignore this any longer. So what is the new public health order about? So the new public health order is going to attempt to address some of these issues by strengthening African institutions, strengthening the public health workforce, expanding local manufacturing, particularly of vaccines, which has become my slight obsession over the recent year, and increasing domestic investment and resources for health, and improving partnerships with donors. So this is a part of a wider growth towards regionalism in global health that we're seeing across Africa and is leading to many changes. Thinking about this initiative, it is of course really welcome. Okay, so African leaders, donors have been crying out for leadership and greater regionalism with these kind of initiatives for decades. And here it is. Here is a program that is being led by Africans with funding that's hopefully coming from the continent. It comes off the back of this significant growth in regional health initiatives and a wider shift towards greater self-reliance and regionalism, and acknowledgement that something has to change. So of course, this is why everyone's quite excited about it. This is why it's seen as quite welcome. But just a few challenges before I pass on to my colleagues. Firstly, we have to ask ourselves, when tackling this massive inequality issue of health, what is new here? This new public health order isn't as new as it seems. It's still incredibly reliant on donors. The whole package is about making sure the donors can keep investing. In terms of local vaccine manufacturing, this depends on Gavi, so that's the Vaccines Alliance buying those vaccines because it's the biggest market actor. That again is relying on that kind of charity model. And global health has a long history of this. After every health emergency or crisis, they create new institutions, new actors. This is just now happening at the regional level. The second issue is what gets missed. So lots of financing towards the health sector in Africa has aligned to the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. But this has increased the kind of vertical health financing around specific issues. So HIV and AIDS, and malaria, for example, or maternal mortality. But that creates these kind of silos, which means you don't have investment in health systems. And as everyone knows, if you don't invest in health systems, you're not investing in healthcare. So traditionally what's happened is people have used that kind of funding to these issues such as HIV and AIDS or kind of after Ebola health security to take that money to fund health systems. So is that what's going to happen now? You have all this money towards vaccines and somehow you have to accrue that money to the wider health sector. It also distorts the focus away from issues where progress has been made, so notably maternal health care across the continent. And fundamentally, this is not about health inequality, this initiative. It's about global health security. And so security is always going to be about those high profile risks like COVID-19 rather than everyday threats, which is strong health systems. And finally, Africa CDC, which is behind this whole initiative, is not without its politics. And I think there's also a tendency that African countries are acting as a concerted whole, and that's no different to how the EU doesn't act as a whole in these kind of ways. We have to question who is going to benefit from this new public health order. Is it just South Africa, Rwanda, Nigeria, or is this going to be benefits from across the continent? And who is at risk? The feminist in me, and a feminist who's worked at Warwick that has a long history of international political economy research, if you set up these vaccine hubs, that's going to have a massive impact on the communities in which those vaccines are set up, those hubs are set up. What kind of distorting influences is that going to have on the local economy and local healthcare as well? Also, there's problems in changing leadership. So the new public health order was partly the brainchild of the very charismatic John Nkengasong, who has gone on to run PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the big US bilateral project in the country. He was a huge driving force between Africa and CDC. The new director of African CDC, Jean Kaseya, has come to power amid some controversy, should we say, about his appointment process, and that is hugely bringing into question how this is going to be implemented in the future. So we always get carried away with these new initiatives, but actually it's not without its politics in the way. So to sum up, can the new public health order end health inequality in Africa? It looks very exciting, it is full of promises. And I think there's a strong case to kind of end this history of inequality. And the combination of COVID-19, the growth of regional health bodies, some key leaders getting behind it, so there is this impetus for change and a new vision. But for these challenges to be overcome, the new public health order really has to be new. It has to break from the old order of global health governance and not repeat the mistakes of the past global health governance and set a genuinely new direction in tackling health inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. If you want to pass your microphone to Joy, and I'll pass mine to Samuel in the first instance. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Caroline. So I'm going to start off by so I'm Samuel, Assistant Professor Teaching, Warwick Economics. And I'm basically going to start off by characterizing the structure and nature of income and wealth inequality around the continent. Because what is mostly seen is that we consider inequality at the African level and forget that across the continent there are differences in the level. So basically, in terms of income inequality, it's just the difference between wage income or labor income of people, and wealth inequality is simply the differences in the assets or the capital income that people might have. So over the continent, you would see differences. The fact remains that Africa is the most unequal continent that you would have, but also historically there are linkages between pre-independence characteristics and post-independence political economy and institutions that exist. So the most unequal parts of Africa are mostly countries that are previous white settler colonization countries. So countries that had unfair land distribution policies, low levels of labor mobility, low levels of labor income across the continent. And a typical example is South Africa that everybody knows. And you find a similar example like Namibia, where white-owned lands are obvious. And the attempt to control this in terms of income inequality has been to provide, let's say, old age distribution, so giving money to people of old age. Those have been basically the attempt, and that is how income inequality has been dealt with. But so in terms of statistics, for instance, income inequality is 65% in South Africa, but wealth inequality in itself, so the share of the top 10% South Africans' wealth is 85%, and the share of the bottom 50% is negative 2.5%. So wealth inequality in itself is a huge thing in South Africa. And that is what has not been dealt with. Now, compared to a place like Zimbabwe, which has a similar characteristics like South Africa, white settler colonization, it has a relatively lower level of inequality simply because it attempted redistribution of lands over the period. So to an extent has dealt with it better than South Africa. So between the two, and if you compare that to the northern part of Africa, which has a different characterization, they have relatively lower levels of inequality, and it's simply because they had independence early, and they joined what we call the Arab Socialism League. So they had state-controlled socialist societies like the Abdul Nasser of Egypt, and over the period, similar countries. So you'd find that those countries have relatively lower levels of inequality. But you compare, let's say, Algeria, Egypt to a place like Morocco, which has high levels of inequality simply because it had a monarchy. And you know that with monarchies, wealth are always concentrated in the people that are closest to the monarchs. So these are the differences in characterization. You go to a place like West Africa, which has the lowest level of inequality, which is surprising to some people. And it's mostly because these countries have a huge informal sector. What that means is that people naturally and normally have wealth because they have the power to own businesses and stuff like that. So, and then they mostly had independence early. So those countries have relatively lower levels of inequality. What that means is that you can look at the general statistics in Africa and decide what should best fit each part of the continent. Because you look at the examples in East Africa and then middle parts of Africa, and it's completely different on that level. Now, the other side of it is why it's become important. And I find the African story. So there's a statement that I found puzzling. It says that Africa is too poor to be unequal because you're looking at differences in incomes and differences in wealth. So if there are lots of poor people on the continent by definition, then why should there be differences in income amongst them? But what you would normally find is that it's in the perception of how unequal a continent is. So for most places to deal with inequality, so we should understand and appreciate that it is unequal. And if you have a society that believes that it is okay for some to be blessed more than others, then inequality does not become an issue to deal with to start with. So the society itself must appreciate. And the fact that there are intergenerational implications, not just inequality being intergenerational, but the solutions to inequality are intergenerational in themselves. So for instance, if you provide education, poverty and inequality are in themselves at the individual level, much as they are measured at the household level. The implications are always at the individual level, and the differences are always at the individual level. So if you provide initiatives that deal with individual levels of inequality, you solve intergenerational implications of it. And the other side is definitely, we know that there are poverty implications of it too. Now, to the solutions that have gone on over the continent, and as an economist, and I've seen papers that try failed experiments over the period. And what they have is targeted transfer. So I'm giving you money and I'm giving it to you because I want to see if you get more vaccination. I want to see if your kids will go to, conditional on the fact that your kids attend school regularly, so there's no absenteeism. And that is, and there are successful field experiments to show that when you have such targeted or conditional grants, it seems to work. But it is problematic in itself to implement because this is a continent that struggles with raising its own revenues. So you can't have that level of redistribution that may exist in Europe. So that is a problem in itself. The other side is defining who is poor with a high level of informal sector. It is really erroneous to say that those in the informal sector are poorer than those in the formal sector. Because for anyone who has a lived experience of the continent, they are well aware that those in the informal sector make more than those in the formal sector. Then the other side of it is, where do we raise the revenues to target? And it's easier to raise revenues by targeting those that you can easily spot how much they earn, so the regular income earners. But the problem with that is that with a huge informal sector, you're already going to tax the overburdened because they are the fewer part of the society. So that becomes almost an impossible avenue. So targeting becomes almost impossible for most countries. Some have also suggested that, well, you can provide subsidies for basic goods that everybody enjoys, including fuel subsidies. And Nigeria is going through fuel subsidy issues at the moment. People are arguing against taking off fuel subsidies. And the idea is simply because, well, the rich can buy more fuel. But what about this argument that as long as the poor can get access to it, doesn't matter how much the rich may use, because someone may need public transport and the public transport operator may need fuel to operate the public transport. So as long as it is cheaper for them to afford, you could still redistribute by providing subsidies on that level. What has been successful for some countries, apart from redistribution, is what we call the public goods provision. So you take an example like Ghana that has free secondary education at the moment, but there are also challenges in that case. So if you are funding, I've already talked about the funding challenges. And let's say the latest figure in 2021 shows that they spent the equivalent of 400 million pounds a year to educate 1.3 million Ghanaians, young Ghanaians to senior high school. And what that meant was that for any junior high school student that's already examined to senior high school, almost 600,000 of them in that year, 97.1% of them got access to secondary schools simply because there was funding provided by the government. And that it solves the intergenerational form of inequality. But the challenge would then be funding. At the moment, Ghana is under IMF. And the interesting discussion going on is whether or not to keep free SHS for everyone, whether or not to make it targeting when we come even to issues of measuring who deserves to get it. So let those who can afford pay for it. But how do you define who can afford? So it becomes easier having public goods kind of targeting to solve inequality. But what I believe is an interesting aspect of inequality, a solution to inequality at the moment that we may not be paying attention to, is the growing level of online businesses, especially in the case of income. So if people are getting less into formal jobs, if the informal sector is difficult to measure how much they are earning, those informal jobs are having additional jobs online. So what that means is that they don't need to leave their offices and go to the markets or to start businesses like the informal sector does, but they can stay in their houses and also have online businesses as additional sources of income to deal with the differences in income that may exist. So I believe that is another source of another solution that paying attention to could also resolve some of the intergenerational problems that may exist. So that would be my opening statement.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Joy, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joy. I'm an assistant prof at the law school, and my statements are on the context of digital financial inclusion and how, or the ways in which it kind of highlights inequalities, right? So I've been researching on digital finance for a little over 13 years. And at the start of my research, there was a new innovation called mobile money in Kenya by way of M-Pesa. I'm sure you've heard of it. And it was this invention, I don't know whether to call it an invention or an innovation, of digitalization of finance that was kind of promoted as this tool that was going to leapfrog us into the future and alleviate poverty, right? So part of my statements are about the narratives around inequality and how we perceive poverty and what tools are available and kind of how the politics around these success narratives. And a classic example is M-Pesa, right? So many states across Africa have tried to replicate the success of M-Pesa because of its promise to alleviate poverty. And you'll see that digital finance or digital financial inclusion has been a central policy focus in alleviating poverty. But what happens on the ground is completely different. As some of you may have probably seen the data on the gains made by digital financial inclusion or financial inclusion by itself, is that yes, it gives access to people who are previously excluded from financial services, but it has minimal gains for poverty alleviation for various reasons, right? So the question is always asked, why is it completely successful in Kenya and not, for instance, in Brazil or in Ethiopia or Tanzania, or similar projects in India have not sort of achieved the same level of success? Well, my argument, and many arguments, are always about the politics around it, right? And politics cannot be excluded from inequality, particularly when we're talking about poverty alleviation. And I think he mentioned the fact that income inequality and intergenerational wealth, well, digital finance has actually exacerbated all the intergenerational income inequality, because we have certain peculiarities in the way we regard or we relate to money and finance in African states. Now in Kenya, we have what we call the African tax, where whoever moves to the city or makes it in life or goes to university will have to remit funds back home, what we call home, to our parents to help with other siblings and other sort of financial obligations, right? So digital finance has highlighted that, because previously you would have to remit it physically, but now it's instantaneous, right? So the burden is on those who earn the said income, right? So there are other underlying sort of structural gaps that need to be addressed, such as the gender inequality brought on by digital finance, where women are expected to provide for families. And it's almost always women, through their either informal or formal work or irregular or precarious work that they do. Another aspect of digital finance is that there's this narrative that if you're using any digital financial product, then you can entrepreneur your way out of your poverty. Now, this is a narrative that's also been co-opted by campaign promises. And recently we had our elections in 2022, and the current president's main manifesto was through a campaign promise called Hustler versus Dynasty narrative, which is seen by some to be a populist narrative. So in this Hustler versus Dynasty narrative, he positioned poor Kenyans as hustlers against the dynasties of the rich. So it was a politics of class grievance, right? And the promises he made to the hustlers, who are mostly youth in Kenya, was that he would provide a special fund that would help them get micro loans, right? So it's purely a microfinance fund. Now, this microfinance fund is or has been refashioned and being called the Financial Inclusion Fund, right? So it's kind of a rebrand of microfinance in the early 80s and 90s, kind of reproducing the same processes that exploited people into now government policy. And part of this, or rather the selling point of this hustler fund, is that they would use digital tools, right? So the main intermediary is a private company that would disburse these loans, right? So you can already see that a private sector is providing government funds, and that already breaks down trust within the people, right? But as it was sold as an entrepreneurship fund, a microcredit fund, it gained traction, right? So my statement is about how digital finance, though has the potential to do good, has been co-opted by separate agendas and is entrenching further inequalities. Yeah.
And last but not least, our final panelist for this afternoon, Ben, over to you.
Okay, is that going? Yeah, okay. I'm Ben Ferguson. I'm a professor in the philosophy department and the director of the PPE program here at Warwick, which to people in health sometimes means something different, but it's philosophy, politics, and economics, if that's the kind of PPE we're talking about. Both are important, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what philosophers think about equality. Sometimes if you ask a philosopher to talk about ethics or moral values, you can get a long-winded response that isn't so tied to practical issues in society. I'll give you a little bit of a long-winded response up front, but I'm going to tie it in at the end to some practical issues as well. So a big debate within philosophy around equality is equality of what? So a prominent topic is this question, what is it that we think we should equalize when we say that we care about equality? And at the risk of oversimplifying responses to this question, I think we can say that they fall into two broad categories. So one group argues that particular outcomes should be equalized, that is equality of income or wealth, or more broadly and abstractly, equality of well-being is important. But another group argues that what matters is persons' opportunities to realize equality. So they claim that what matters morally is whether Bob has the chance to earn as much as Alice, not whether or not he actually takes up this opportunity. The equality of opportunity folks are concerned about personal responsibility, about how we should respond to situations in which inequalities are or are not someone's fault. On the other hand, outcome egalitarians think that getting bogged down in these details can lead to victim blaming and overcomplicates our responses to equality. I think that, again, broadly speaking, outcomes should be one of many goals of public policy, outcome equality, that is. We should strive to create societies of equals. And in certain micro-level interactions where we have more information or where gathering more information might be appropriate, we might want to apply the opportunity notion of equality. This leads me to a second debate. Do we value equality intrinsically, that is for its own sake, or instrumentally because it provides other goods that we value? If we value equality only intrinsically, then we should not be opposed to leveling down those who are better off. For example, in a society where some persons suffer from blindness, if we can't provide sight to everyone, then an intrinsic value of equality means we should not be opposed to blinding those who are sighted so that there are no inequalities in vision. But because this seems perverse, many philosophers argue that we value equality instrumentally because of the other kinds of goods that it brings. I think that's primarily correct. We often do value equality instrumentally, but we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that intrinsic and instrumental value are mutually exclusive. So suppose that I'm a coin collector in a foreign country that has beautiful currency. I might value the coins in my wallet both for instrumental reasons because they allow me to buy my lunch and intrinsically because they're aesthetically appealing. Sometimes we trade off equality because other things matter more, in the same way that we might spend some of those coins for lunch, and other times we hold on to equality because it's valuable in itself. So consider, for example, the ultimatum game in economics. Ultimatum games are two-player games where player A proposes a distribution of a particular sum, suppose it's $100 that they're distributing, to player B. And player B can then accept or reject A's offer. If B accepts A's offer, both receive what A proposed. And if B rejects it, neither player gets anything. So in most cases where A offers a very unequal distribution to B, say A says, I will give you $5 and I will keep $95 for myself. In most cases, in situations like this, player B rejects the offer and neither person gets anything. And this is a situation where player B is valuing intrinsically the equality that they're not receiving over the well-being that they could have received from the $5. But in other cases where you also have unequal distributions offered by A, but not so unequal, so say something like a 60-40 distribution, player B often accepts. In this case, trading off the slight inequality for greater welfare improvements. In different contexts and in different countries, and with different income levels, people will have a greater or lesser taste for inequality. And this is something that can be really interesting to look at cross-culturally and also across differences in income. Now, one reason that we might value equality instrumentally is because of its effects on and relationship with democracy. So it's essential, equality is essential to democracy, and democracy, when paired with equality, leads to relatively stable political systems. It's important that we are able to relate to each other as equals in the political domain, because this is where the rules that govern our societies are established. If people do not feel society's rules reflect their values and their voices, then the legitimacy and authority of these rules and those that enforce them is undermined. This is, in part, I believe, one of the many sources of conflict within my own country, the United States. Citizens on both ends of the political spectrum no longer feel that their voices and views count. It's also a lesson for those whose views are better backed by evidence and argument. So even if you are correct, if you are elected to serve, you need to understand and engage with those in your constituency with whom you fundamentally disagree. Treating others as equals and promoting the equality of distribution of goods goes a long way towards preserving the legitimacy of a democratic system and hopefully towards making it more just as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, all four of you. So within about half an hour, we've heard about how important equality is and inequality, and we've touched upon various dimensions of that, whether it's in terms of democracy, whether it's in terms of political factors, whether it's in terms of educational factors, economic, finance, digital literacy, and health aspects. We've touched on a huge range of issues, and so now it's over to all of you to ask what questions you have for our panelists on this broad range of issues that we've spoken about in the last few minutes. So this is where I get to be the roving reporter with a microphone. So any questions?
Hello, everyone. My name is Brenda King, and I'm an alumna of Warwick. So it's great to be back. I traveled up from London today. I want to congratulate you on the African Inequality Learning Group. And for the past 18 years until Brexit, I was with the EU institution, and we had something, what we'll call an African Development Learning Group, you know, from the EU side and from Africa. Although it wasn't academic, it was business associations, trade unions, NGOs, farmers, etc. Now, what I found this very, very interesting. So given my background, I wondered if this group will be linking with those, you know, whether it's women's groups, business association, trade unions, to share some of the learning. And also to mention a point I heard this morning about the EU going to give Tanzania $1 billion to stop people coming into Europe. And the reason why I mentioned that is because just last week, I was hearing that the debt service payments from Africa is set next year to hit $74 billion, which is 16 billion more than the aid that it's currently getting. So I would like to hear some comments on that, because that takes the focus away from Africa and what's happening, and you know, some of what the development countries are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good question. Good pair of questions. So I'm going to stand at the front. They could be questions for our panelists, but they could also be questions for our initial three speakers from this afternoon. Franklin, is there anything you want to say first of all? Because the first part of the question related directly to the Africa Inequality Learning Group.
I don't know, probably Patrick might be better suited for this, but what we envisage with the Africa Inequality Learning Group is that we want to establish a forum, a platform where the key target, if I would use the word target, will be policy, people, and planners. And the reason for this is their influence on outcomes with respect to development, be it human or physical development, and the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. I make this point because we feel that one of the potential partners of this initiative is the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. We've actually connected with them. As a matter of fact, I believe that the director of the macroeconomic policy of the UN Economic Commission for Africa might be following this discussion online, because he was supposed to be coming, but he couldn't. And the importance of linking up with the UNECA is that they have a broad continental mandate to deal with various dimensions of development, not only macroeconomic issues, but also issues relating to social policies. We're also thinking about the issues relating to gender equality. So I believe that through a link with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, we should be in a position to identify and work with many of the groups, including third sector organizations like trade unions and private sector organizations. The other point you mentioned, well, probably I leave it there. Two-part question.
Okay, thank you, Franklin. Patrick, did you want to come in on that as well? I thought that you did.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a quick point on the question that was posed on whether we intend to link this to business groups. In fact, I think it's a very relevant and timely question, because one of the stakeholders that we want to get involved in this initiative is basically firms. When we talk about inequality, most people think about governments, but it's not only about governments. The private sector has a critical role to play, in terms of addressing issues of inequality. As we all know in the economics literature, labor market institutions play a very important role in terms of combating inequality. Whether firms allow trade unions to exist in their corporations, whether they are, accommodating of, governments coming up with minimum wage legislations and all that. So it's a very important constituency, and it's one of the groups that we want to integrate into this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to come over here first, and then we've got a hand raised over there, and we had a hand raised there initially, so you look like you desperately wanted to come in there. So shall I come to you first, and then I'll come to this gentleman whose hand's been raised for a while, and then I'll come to you, okay?
Thanks. This is a question actually from the chat online from Mark Kia, who works in the DRC for the UNHCR. He's asked 3 questions, but I'll just, in the interest of time, just ask one on his behalf. He wanted to know from the panel your views on the role of conflict and displacement on inequality. So he gives the example of the DRC, which has over 6 million displaced persons, most of whom are dependent upon humanitarian assistance, with women as the most affected by the negative impact of displacement. So some thoughts on that would be welcome.
Thank you very much. Have we got any of our panelists who'd like to volunteer a response on that? Okay, Sophie.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I had a couple of responses, also in response to Brenda's question as well. I also think it's really important to know what is the appropriate partnership, particularly as British institutions. So, for example, with this whole initiative for vaccine manufacturing, the UK government is fascinated by this, and they want to know, which winners are we backing, who should be investing, what can we get out of it? And personally, I'm not interested in that. I'd be much more interested in partnerships with African delegations who are going into these negotiations, who don't have the teams that are the same size as the US government or the EU, because often they have reams, as you know, working from the EU, reams of documentation to read. They don't have the teams to read it because of the sheer size of it, and to work out how in health diplomacy, how my research and people I work with can support the sort of work that they're doing in that way. And similarly, when is it appropriate to align with feminist activists or trade unions? I think it depends on the type of work, because working in a British context, the British government is not always acting in the interests of African states in the same way I might want to. And then the other problem, I think the debt question, I think the answer is in your question, and aid is how we rethink aid, whether we need aid, what aid does, and versus debt relief, and how it's a smokescreen for that. And I think we're all very aware of that, but then these debates always fall off. Joy and I were having a chat about this, about how these trends that you see from the 90s come back and that everyone forgets about that. Why are we still saying that aid is working? That we're all in this, that we have to say aid is working when often it's not working. And then the question from the DRC on conflict and displacement inequality, obviously it has a huge impact, but I think my concern, particularly in the DRC, when we saw what happened around sexual exploitation and abuse by people linked to the World Health Organization, the worst case in the history of the UN that happened in the DRC, this exceptionalism of the international community when in these countries exacerbating inequalities, which is something we don't talk about enough. Even with this scandal, it's been kind of put under the carpet a lot. So it's actually, we need to make sure inequalities aren't exacerbated, not only by the conflict or the health crisis or emergency, but those people who are tasked to actually address these concerns with really vulnerable people. And that to me is a real issue.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm conscious of time as well, so I'll come over to you next.
Thank you. My name is Gordon. I would like the panel to make a comment on how ownership and control can contribute to squaring the sake of inequality that we are discussing in this room. I'm asking this question. I come from Zambia, and I remember a few years ago, we had a strike going on in one of the mines. And that strike went on for less than 5 days. And when the mine published the income that they had lost because of that strike, we learned that the money was equivalent to the national budget of Zambia. And that's just one mine. And we've been mining copper for the last 100 years. So how does ownership and control promote or enhance inequality or try to resolve the problem of inequality in Africa?
Thank you very much, Ben.
I have something small. Ben might have something more to say than I do. And this isn't maybe what you're looking for, Golden, but one way in which ownership can be complicated or complicate inequality has to do with inheritance. So you're not thinking necessarily, I think, about inheritance in your question, but let me give you that kind of an answer. When you have inheritance and you can pass down through particular families, and you have this intergenerational problem where inequality doesn't go away. And banning inheritance is really difficult to do. Because if you tell people that, well, often people work for their children's futures, right? They work to secure their children's futures and they want to pass on their wealth to their children. If you tell them that they can't do this when they die, they'll do it before they die. They'll do it in formal ways before they die as well. So this is one sticky issue that has to do with ownership, where you can transfer ownership of goods that you have to the next generation. If you didn't have something like this and it went in some magical way back into a public pot and was redistributed, you'd see inequalities being harder to persist over different generations. I don't want to make Sam do this, but maybe he has something to say that's a little bit more directly tied to the ownership question you had.
Thank you, Ben. So related, so in terms of inequality, what's evident is that countries with high mining has high level of inequality because of the mining rent that's associated with it. And it's mostly because of how such contracts in themselves are constructed to start with. And I believe that it's about time, after years of maybe handing over resources to people with perpetual ownership of it. Maybe some countries could get back to renegotiating some of these deals because I am aware, for instance, in Ghana, where over a period of time, a mining company like Anglo Gold Ashanti, you know the difference between, let's say, Johannesburg and a place like Obuasi in Ghana, which are both gold producing areas. The poverty and inequality levels are high. And after years of mining, the mine in Obuasi almost came to a zero, to the extent that it was sold to the government for $1, which has now been rearranged as a public-private sector initiative led by the private sector. And one other example from Ghana, for instance, is the reason they have lower levels of conflict with natural resource, especially with oil, is because they went the Norwegian way in terms of the policy negotiations and design of oil-related policies. So I believe that until we get out of the perpetual contracts that you've given to people and renegotiate, have the confidence of renegotiating some of these contracts, some of the implications of the mining rents in terms of inequality would persist. As long as you have the boldness to renegotiate some of these contracts, it would persist.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, and it's fantastic because I've got lots of people who are all raising their hands. We started 5 minutes late, so I'm hoping I can extend this till 25 to. Franklin's not saying no, so okay, and Mike's saying yes. Okay, you were next.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. So my question is linked to the dichotomy that was we first got from the instrumentality and inherent question, as well as policy free SHS. So I'm also from Ghana, and one of the questions that you keep on hearing when you're talking about policies that are like open access, that seeks to ensure equality in distribution and in access, is the question of quality. So in Ghana, one of the biggest questions that people keep on asking is, okay, we're allowing everyone to go to school, everyone is going to high school. Are the outcomes the way we want them to be? And I'm sure Professor over here will have a very, will have a take on it, having worked with National Math and Science Quiz. I'm sure she has a lot to say on that. So my question is, how then, as policymakers, what should be the trade-off for policymakers, and where do you strike the balance? Do you, at some point in time, say, okay, everyone should go through it? And again, it's hard because you are constrained by budgets, so you're not always going to get like the quality that you want to get, but you also want a situation where you want to like erase inequality. So as policymakers, what do you like? How do you strike the balance?
Thank you, Ben.
I'll be brief here, but I think that this is exactly the kind of trade-off that you're looking at between outcome equality or opportunity for equality, right? So it can be very difficult to pinpoint who it is who should be getting subsidized to go to school in that particular example. And so the cost of putting together a kind of opportunity for equality kind of public policy can sometimes be higher than just giving out free education to everybody, because that can be an easier way of implementing the policy. But, and I don't know about the facts on the ground in Ghana, but that can then not be the best way of eradicating inequality if it ends up subsidizing the children of the rich as well, right? So sometimes you maybe do want to spend more on your public policy to try to map it to the right individuals.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question because I've got 4 people with their hands up here. So I'm going to try to get round all of them. Okay, so I've seen 2 gentlemen with hands up here. I've seen 2 gentlemen with hands up on this side of the room, and that will be the end of the questions. Okay.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Charles. I'm an entrepreneur from Ghana. And my question has to do with IP research and knowledge inequality between countries in the African continent and the rest of the world. Africa currently contributes less than 1% of global research. And the thing is that research and knowledge and know-how, I believe, creates wealth, which leads to more inequality. And so if a lot of the research is being done outside of Africa, and also particularly seeing that countries in Africa might not have the resources to acquire, all the wonderful machines and set up all the spaces required for this research, then inequality perhaps might continue. So I want to hear comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Joy, can I turn to you? Can I put you on the spot for this? Because No, okay.
No, but just a brief comment on a previous question.
Okay.
I think, well, what we tend to argue as lawyers is that there should be a politics of redistribution from the start. I mean, you just have to have it. And I don't know whether it's through taxation or it's through other economic models, but there just has to be a politics of redistribution to begin with. Yeah.
And,
yes.
and so then, Sophie, can I ask you to address the issue of IP, because it's so it comes up so often in health issues.
Oh, I mean, Joy just turned to me and went research director. So yeah, as director of research in my school. I think what's really interesting is what's happening now, particularly in UK higher education, is that you cannot get away with doing a research project on Africa without some involvement with an African institution, African scholars. The problem is how that still is extractive and how that is still then going back to the continent, how those investments are happening. So I think it's really important how we think about this in terms of research funding and also research partnerships, and that they are truly equitable and all parties benefit in that way, instead of just come and do your PhD here at Warwick and that's it, which I'm not saying that's amazing, but you know, what happens next is at the end point. IP is huge, and I think this is the big problem that I'm interested in with the vaccine manufacturing, is who is going to own the intellectual property of this? Is it states in partnership with private corporations? Where are those private corporations based? Because that is going to have an extractive problem that comes back to your point of ownership and control, which is fundamental. And funny, I just want to come back to the universal question about universal education. From a healthcare point of view, actually, there's nothing wrong with subsidising the kids of the rich, because when people pay in and they see it working, they're more likely to have trust and confidence in public health services, pay their taxes, go into this kind of revenue kind of ideas. So whilst I can see there's a problem where you're like, well, the state doesn't have that much money, should it be doing it? Thinking about that in a long term in terms of revenue generation and people wanting to see better public services, I think is quite important as well.
Okay, thank you very much. You've been waiting to come in on a couple of points.
Yeah. My name is Daniel, a doctoral student at the Warwick Law School. My issue is with the Ghanaian free HS thing. I think in Ghana, is a comment, in Ghana, the issue of introducing free education was more of political than the actual problem that we were trying to solve. We were rather, in our quest to solve a problem, we created problem. Look, when Ghana had independence in 1957, Nkrumah saw the need to create the gap between the undeveloped North and the South. The South mostly occupied by the British and the elite education establishments there. So Nkrumah felt like, look, the North had to be educated. Free education was introduced there. And over time, the gap was closing. But this government came, and in the hope of staying in power for years, then we have to make education free for everybody. How can you make education free for everybody on the basis of grants and funds from elsewhere? Whatever the Western countries, we know international political economy, gave to us, it comes with conditionalities. Now, the mass number of people that we are producing in the name of free HS, free SHS or whatever it is, where are they going from there? The universities have produced so many people, and in Ghana we have Unemployment Graduate Association. Come on. So are we just, for the political reasons, producing without facing the reality? Thank you.
So getting back to what Joy said, so there is definitely a political economy decision to be made. And that example I gave was to show the differences in the forms of redistribution that may happen. So you could have a direct transfer form of redistribution and a form that is a public good kind of form of redistribution, which could be education provision or even health, free health care or something like that. But I agree, as I said, I mentioned the challenges with funding to start with, the fact that a developing country spends 400 million pounds on education in itself makes it unsustainable given its revenue challenges. And of course, it's obvious that it was rushed in the implementation, and there are challenges that have even worsened the expected positive effects of it. Yes, so I agree, but I gave it as an example of the differences in the forms of redistribution that may happen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Akion Wali. I'm an assistant professor in international relations and security. And I really enjoyed much of your discussions, but there was this element of politics there that I didn't say. So I was just wondering, where's the politics? The economics was there, the philosophy was there, and everything. Because I think there's a lot going on that I've tried to conceptualize as this intellectual abracadabra, right? The more you look, the less you see. That's the way we conceptualize in Nigeria. Because when we look at the history, right? If we pay attention to history, I'm happy that Sam mentioned history there. We see that we're not just talking about equality of outcomes and opportunities. There's also the aspect of equality of being, right? And if we go back in history, for example, if we engage with ideas from Immanuel Kant, from John Locke, for example, in the two treatises or in the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina, it was unequivocal when it was saying that not only that blacks were excluded from the three inalienable rights. So these are inalienable, you cannot take them away. Life, liberty, and property, private property, but that they could be owned as property. So we're not just talking about people having equality of outcomes and or equality of opportunities. We're saying they are not even in that calculation of equality, that they are naturally unequal. This is not just something that Locke was saying. Locke was not just somebody in a basement and being crazy and being locked away. This was the general knowledge. Immanuel Kant engaged with that, with the concept of personhood and sub-personhood. And Africa, within that kind of context and history, emerged into global politics. So it's not just about Africa being Africa, it's Africa within European imagination. And that's how politics and economics has emerged. So basically what I'm saying is when you talk about equality and inequality today, how far or what role does race play in this? Because we're talking about international institutions. We know they are very Eurocentric. We know that somebody that is just schooled goes there and lectures countries and societies that they've never been to based on particular indices that have never been tested, which is really some that have very high thresholds of danger because of things that cannot be undone. For example, when you talk about vaccine and stuff like that, and they only have this power based on the skin color and the history of them being positioned as higher relative to particular other people. So for me, I just think that politics is just something that was quite missing from the panel, but otherwise I enjoyed every other aspect of the presentation.
Thank you. Given that all the panelists were smiling and nodding, I think they agree as well. So I'm going to take that as a very valid comment rather than a question, and also because I'm mindful of time, and I'm going to go to the final person who had his hand up.
Right, thanks. I'm Kevin Ibe. I have a couple of comments to make, not necessarily a question. And I think the last speaker also very kindly teed me up a little bit. I use the elephant analogy, which is to say, frankly, when you have a very complex hydra-headed problem, it's appropriate and entirely appropriate that people approach it from different dimensions. And I think that's what I've seen, we've looked at it from different perspectives and very interesting, in fact, excellent ideas already discussed. But I want to follow up on what our colleague has said. Okay, before saying that, I think the title we have here about launch of African Inequality Learning Group, I kind of have been looking at it a bit critically, and I'm wondering is that really what this group is about? Because are we really interested in inequality within African societies and African countries? Or are we looking at inequality, Africa being unequal relative to the rest of the world? And it seems to me that the latter is what the challenge is, the fact that Africa is being caught adrift, is lagging. And for maybe some of the reasons that our colleague has just enunciated, the continent needs to probably be, I don't want to use the word supported or assisted, but given the platform to probably catch up a little bit. So that's where maybe the point about resource transfer, there's a discussion going on about reparations. I use the word resource transfer, and it's not necessarily a novel idea, because as we speak, some countries, well, Germany, I think, is still paying reparations to Israel, right? And there is a discussion. I know people like, say, Nigeria, Moshood Abiola died in 1998, but I think his presidential election was built around the idea of the need for reparations. I also know the challenges associated with reparations, because of the governance challenges and failures within the continent. If you transfer resources that are going to be pilfered and siphoned away, so those are real challenges. But nevertheless, it seems to me that if we are looking to tackle global inequality, we need to consider a resource transfer. How do you do that? It seems to me that the building blocks of development, of transformational development, and we recognize education as being one of those. We recognize, say, health provision as being one of those. Safety net as being one of those. So how do you transfer resources to those critical areas of needs? Those building blocks that would help Africa to begin to catch up. And it seems to me that this is, this learning group, in addition to probably having another look at the title, and I probably hold myself also, well, very, very partly responsible, because both Franklin and Patrick very kindly drew my attention to both the title and the group several months ago. So I probably should have made this point a bit earlier. But I think this needs to be part of the agenda. How do we help orchestrate the much needed transfer of resources to those critical areas of needs? I think about health insurance. I don't know what the evidence is in terms of research. It is not my area of research, but it seems to me that health challenges and is a major cause of poverty and limiting people's chances to education being another one, and safety nets that you've got in a number of more advanced economies. If resources could be directed to those areas, I think that would be a way of helping us. Remember, there is no silver bullet. I think what we are all reflecting upon are ways to contribute to helping the continent catch up, to narrow the gap. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience. I know we've run over time a little bit. As the chair of this session, I have the difficult job of summing up. I'm going to keep it brief, and I've got just two comments. The first relates directly to this panel, and I think what's become very clear from the last hour and a half is that there are going to be key roles for universities, including the University of Warwick. There's going to be key roles for international institutions and think tanks, also for governments, also for trade unions, as well as for firms in the development challenges. So it's up to all of us to carry on working and talking about those challenges. And then I'm going to finish with a little plug. So Samuel and I are on an editorial board for a journal that's called Cogent Economics and Finance. And along with Franklin, today, to coincide with the launch of the Africa Inequality Learning Group and this initiative with UNCTAD and Repower, we're launching a special issue of the journal, and it's going to, we're inviting submissions looking at the economics of inequality and development. But I was talking over lunch to somebody and saying that economists are very good at building very sophisticated econometric models, and maybe forgetting that in this case, what we want is empirical economics analysis that gives recommendations and lessons for policymakers. And that's going to be the theme of the special issue. So please spread the word to your colleagues, to your partners, and we look forward to getting submissions. And then Franklin, over to you for the final word.
Well, I think the final word will be with Patrick, but I have two comments. There was a gentleman, Charles, from Ghana, who talked about the fact that we in Africa have only 1% of global knowledge and then limited knowledge and access to technology. Well, I think I disagree with his 1%, but this is not the place for that. But what I would say is that it is important that we realize that if we want to tackle issues of inequality, and I refer also briefly to Kevin's point of view, incidentally, Kevin, we are interested in SDG 10, which is inequality within and between countries. The two are linked. But going back to this point, I would say briefly, young man, that the 2 points. One, we need to look at, if I have to choose between innovation and technology, I'll opt for innovation. Why? Innovation is when you use the resources at your disposal to understand and find solutions to your problems. Technology is not a problem. If you have plenty of money, like the rich Arabs, you can buy any technology. But innovation is more important. And I think what we should strive for in the case of Africa, and I say so as an African myself, we should create and develop knowledge societies. We should invest in the creation of knowledge societies, because only the creation of knowledge societies will make it possible for us to understand and take action on what we can do without waiting until we get advice from outside or resources from outside. And I know a lot can be done. I share Kevin's concern, obviously. This particular learning group stems from a request, and I think by the African ministers themselves. I think I'm correct that they wanted the United Nations Economic Commission to look at various means of creating a better understanding of the problem of inequality. And the learning group is one of these. It's not the only one. So that, and within the context of the learning group, there will be scope for understanding the situation of inequality between countries and the situation of the disadvantaged situation of African economies in terms of action over policy decisions, as well as access to vital resources. So I just wanted to make that point before I give the mic to, I think on the program it says the next step by Patrick.
Patrick, I'm going to be really sorry. Can you make it really quick?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, let me begin by saying that this has been a very insightful and productive session. A lot of really interesting messages came out of it, but I just want to highlight two. I think the first, which is really important, is a point that Daniel Roderick and also Joseph Stiglitz have been making over the past few years, and that is that inequality is not inevitable. It arises from choices, policy choices made by governments, and so it's something we can deal with. We have the tools to deal with inequality. So that's one. That's the good news. Second point I want to make is that just from the discussions we've had here over the past hour, it's clear that it has multiple dimensions. So it's not something we look at purely as an economic issue. Political representation is important. I think we talked a lot about politics here. Political representation is important in terms of getting people, to making sure that policymakers address issues of importance to various groups in society. So political representation, but you also have issues of cultural norms that make it very difficult for people from certain groups to effectively participate in the development process. If you want to address issues of inequality, you have to deal with these sorts of issues. So it's not just an economic issue. So I think those are the two key points I really want us to take home, in addition to all the other points that have been made. Now, in terms of the next steps, the first thing we're trying to do is we're trying to get African policymakers fully engaged in this initiative. And we've had consultations with the Africa Capacity Building Foundation. We've had consultations with the UN Economic Commission for Africa at the highest level, and the management, they've all indicated that this is something that they want to be associated with as co-organizers. Now we are looking into the possibility of having another set of meetings with them to sort of agree on the final scope and the modalities for operationalizing the initiative. So that's the first thing. The second thing we're doing is we're also trying to identify research topics, areas where we could work together, between Warwick and some other institutions that we're partnering with, so that we can bring to light some of the key areas, that we consider to be critical to resolving or combating issues of inequality. And then finally is the most important, which is the resource mobilization. We're looking into possibilities of mobilizing resources in order to finance some of the activities that we hope to undertake under the initiative. So let me stop here, and sorry I took too much time.
No, thank you. I think I can offer a whole bunch of very willing to help researchers in the room this afternoon. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our speakers from the start of the session. Thank you to all of you for your great comments and questions. It's refreshments time. Thank you very much.